again and welcome back to another session of commerce class with me, Suman Rathore. Students, shares are basically an instrument for raising capital for a business through investors. Actually, the authorized capital of a company is divided into small units called shares, and the holders of these shares are called shareholders. It expresses the ownership relationship between a company and its shareholders. And shareholders, by way of holding these shares, have some rights, responsibilities and liabilities towards the company. Majorly, a company can issue two types of shares. First is preference share and second is equity shares. Now let's understand these one by one. So first is preference shares. Now preference shares is another important source of business finance. Capital raised through issue of preference shares is known as preference share capital. And preference shareholders have got the preferential rights or priority rights over equity shareholders. Like, preference shareholders get preference over equity shareholders at the time of distribution of dividend, which means that preference shareholders get dividend before it is paid to equity shareholders. And their second preferential right is that the preference share capital is repaid before equity share capital at the time of liquidation or winding up of the company. Apart from these two preferential rights, there are various merits or advantages attached to preference shares. Like first is fixed rate of dividend. Now preference shareholders are paid dividend only at a fixed rate. As such, they do not share profits in case of extra earnings of the company, except in case of participative preference shares. Second is no interference in management. As preference shareholders do not carry voting right, therefore they cannot participate in the management of the company. And the company can raise capital without dilution of equity shareholders' control over the company. Third is no charge on assets. As preference shares do not create any mortgage or charge on the assets of the company, like in case of debentures, the company can keep its fixed assets free for raising loans in the future. And fourth is no danger of overcapitalization. Now, a company can issue redeemable preference shares for a fixed period of time. The capital can be repaid when it is no longer required in the business. Therefore, there is no danger of overcapitalization and the capital structure of the company remains elastic. Apart from these merits or advantages, there are certain limitations of raising funds through preference shares. Like first is expensive source of finance. Preference shares proves to be an expensive source of finance for the companies. Companies have to pay almost as much dividend to preference shareholders as the amount of interest on debt issues. Second is fixed obligation to pay dividend. Now, dividend on preference shares has to be paid at a fixed rate and before any dividend is paid on equity shares. Sometimes companies do not get rid of their liability of paying dividend, like in case of cumulative preference shares, even if there are no profits in a particular year. The amount of dividend due in a particular year is paid in the next year along with the dividend of that year. As such, there is always a fixed obligation on the companies to pay dividend to the preference shareholders regularly. Next is higher rates of dividend. Not only the payment of dividend is a fixed obligation for the company, but the rate of dividend on preference shares is as higher as the rate of interest on debentures. And fourth is no tax savings. Payment of dividend on preference shares is a kind of burden on the finances of the company, as it is not deductible from profits for computing the taxable income of the company. Now, the second type of shares is equity shares. Now, equity shares is the most important source of finance in case of companies, but they do not carry any special rights in payment of dividend or repayment of capital. However, equity shareholders are considered as the real owners of the company, as they enjoy the voting rights and the residual profits left after paying interest to debenture holders and dividend to preference shareholders. The amount raised by the issue of equity shares is known as equity share capital. Now, there are various advantages of equity shares which makes them the most important and the most popular source of raising finance for a company. Like first is permanent capital. Capital raised through the issue of equity shares is considered as permanent funds of a company, as there is no obligation to return the money or redeem the shares except in case of winding up of the company. As such, there is no obligation on the company to return the money. Next is no obligation as to dividend. Equity shares do not impose an obligation to pay a fixed dividend. Dividends are payable only if the company has adequate profits. As such, it is said that equity shareholders stand by the company through thick and thin. Next is no charge on assets. The assets of the company are not mortgaged for raising finance from equity shares. As such, the assets of the company remain free of charge for borrowing money in future. Next is high credit standing. Equity capital provides creditworthiness onto the company and confidence to prospective loan providers. Creditors readily lend money to the company because they know that their money will be safe and they regard equity capital as a safety shield. Besides all these merits of equity shares, there are certain limitations also. Like first is danger of overcapitalization. Now, equity share capital is not refundable during the lifetime of a company. A mistake in estimating the financial requirements may result in overcapitalization, especially when the company's earning capacity declines. As a result, equity capital may remain idle and underutilized. Next is concentration of power. We all know that equity shareholders enjoy full voting power in the management of the company. They also have the preemptive right to buy new shares. As such, whenever any new issue of equity shares is made, it is first offered to the existing shareholders. As a result, there is concentration of control and power in few hands. Next is unsound dividend policy. The rate of dividend is decided by the board of directors. Shareholders cannot demand higher dividends than those recommended by the board of directors. And sometimes directors distribute higher dividends to win the cooperation of equity shareholders. As such, less fund is made available for reserves or replacement than the actual requirement. And the last is high flotation cost. Now, flotation costs are the cost incurred by a company when issuing new shares and securities, like registration expenses, underwriting expenses, legal expenses, etc. Now, the flotation cost in case of equity shares is very much high and costly as compared to other sources of finance. That's all for today. Thanks for staying in tune and don't forget to like and subscribe my channel. Thank you and goodbye for now.